Nicole had reached the point where the ache of postponement hurt more than the pain of rupture. So the morning she filed the divorce, she did it without spectacle, without a final plea to the version of the life she had tried to salvage, and without the illusion that one more conversation would restore a trust already perforated by secrets that bred new secrets in their shadows. The first secret had never belonged to her. It lived in the spaces Ted left whenever the matter of Martin came up, a matter he insisted was a harmless political courtesy, a backroom alignment for a vote that would never touch their home, a compromise that would dissolve once the camera lights cooled. But the thing about compromises is that they calcify into bargains when repeated, and bargains acquire cost when urgency rises, and urgency had risen around Martin the way stormwater climbs a curb, gradually, then all at once. The second secret had a heartbeat and a name. It existed because Leslie refused to be a rumor in a city that thrived on weaponized whispers. What began as a wound that Ted believed he could cauterize with the force of will. One mistake, one apology, one confession deferred until the timing was less catastrophic, became a parallel life escorted by silence. Nicole could have forgiven the once, could have forgiven the panic behind the lie, could have, in a better year, separated the man from the spiral, but forgiveness requires altitude, and the scandal kept her at sea level, drenched and reactive. When the papers were stamped and time shuffled forward by court calendar, there was no relief, only the steadier pain of clarity. She was ready to step beyond the version of herself that managed other people's chaos. Yet the city would not grant her the privacy to do it cleanly. A grainy photograph circulated from a hotel corridor near the marina, a frame caught between door and dusk, and the headline that devoured it insisted Ted had been seen slipping into a room and later into a bed with a man whose features the internet decided belonged to Carlton. The speculation was effortless. Carlton had orbit. He had been present at so many junctures of their marriage that even benign coincidences looked intentional when reframed by hindsight. He had poured coffee the morning after a fundraiser that went sour on live television, walked Nicole to her car when Ted stayed behind to soothe a donor whom Martin needed pacified, offered to review a contract clause when her lawyer was off the grid, and sat silently in the front pew the night an award was handed to Ted for his work on the foundation they had built, as if he had been part of its scaffolding all along. He had that type of proximity that disarms suspicion because it looks like neighborliness until a single piece goes crooked and everything adjacent inherits the slant. The rumor, some sites called it a sighting, others printed it as certainty, arrived at the exact moment Nicole had stabilized her resolve, and she understood almost immediately that timing is not coincidence in a city that schedules even its accidents. If Carlton truly loved Ted, as the more gleeful corners of the internet declared, then the soft persistence of his care could be recast as an agenda. If he had approached Nicole as friend and confidant while wanting her husband, then the neatness of his presence in every crisis might be the neatness of design. Yet she had learned the hard way that the first person to name a pattern is often the one who planted it. So she resisted the temptation to treat rumor as revelation and instead cataloged what she actually knew. Ted had been evasive about Martin because Martin could not survive the daylight of full explanation. The contracts tied to a development pledge turned out to be routed through a philanthropic shell that intersected inconveniently with campaign dollars and a vendor that didn't exist until it needed to. Ted had insisted he was protecting Nicole from political fallout, but in doing so he had made her a liability and a shield, both untenable for a spouse who prefers her dignity unleveraged. Ted had slept with Leslie in a season when the pressure to bridge private loyalty and public duty had stretched him thin. He had told himself it was an aberration. He had not told Nicole when the aberration quickened into a child. He had built a quiet stipend into the foundation's discretionary expenses and called it outreach. Leslie, for her part, did not exist merely as an instrument of Ted's failure. She had her own sense of injury and a memoir of promises that felt real when whispered in the half-light of backstage rooms. And she did not owe the city her invisibility simply because the city preferred its scandals to remain elegant. If she and Carlton had allied, it was not an alliance of caricatures but a convergence of people who had been metabolizing the same man's conflicting versions, and covalence sometimes looks like conspiracy to those outside the reaction. Still, nothing about the bed photo settled with Nicole as truth. The man's profile could be Carlton, but it could also be the result of lens angle and the lazy accuracy of collective desire. The sheets were hotel crisp, the lighting theatrical, the timestamp a neat 15 minutes after an event that gave Ted a perfect alibi for being in that building, which presented a duality. If the alibi affirmed the photo, then the room had been chosen for proximity to the gala rather than for secrecy. If the alibi contradicted it, Then the photo had been staged to frame him where his presence was expected. She followed the invoices instead of the captions and discovered a florist paid twice for the same centerpiece by two different cards. A caterer who swore the dessert table had been moved to a different ballroom at a time when no event had booked that room, and a security vendor who subcontracted to a firm with no physical address. The trail smelled like Martin's method: intermediaries, deniability, the hope that the complexity of the system would defeat the curiosity of the people inside it. And she began to consider a third option that neither exonerated nor condemned Ted but rather placed him in a wider machine that was using him as both pawn and cover. Carlton complicated that theory even as he also gave it shape. He had a history with Leslie that was not romantic but survivorship adjacent. Both had been in rooms where Ted apologized with soft gravity and asked for time he never truly had to repay the account he was overdrawing. A quiet alliance between them would not require villainy, only a shared recognition that waiting had become a form of self-betrayal. If they had compared notes, the timeline would have aligned too cleanly to ignore. The night the Foundation's gala merged with a private dinner for donors Martin needed in his corner. The hour Ted vanished to take a call that extended for precisely the length of the photo's timestamp. The weeks after when a burner number texted Leslie to meet about a settlement for the child that did not require public exposure and offered a figure that matched almost perfectly the amount the Foundation earmarked for an initiative that never launched. But alliances born from injury often invite a third voice that promises closure and delivers chaos. The third voice had a vested interest in reducing Ted to a scandal that could be dismissed as personal weakness rather than examined as a thread tied to Martin's larger web. The third voice had access to venues, to lighting, to a security corridor that could be rerouted or blacked out for 20 minutes without triggering a report because the invoice for those minutes had been submitted under an innocuous line item called risk rehearsal. The third voice wanted Nicole to drive the narrative by filing and then be discredited by the city's sport of reframing a woman's agency as hysteria. The fingerprints on those choices looked more like Martin than anyone else because Martin preferred his fires to start in the far room while he discussed fire codes in the lobby. When Nicole mapped the night of the photo across the city grid, the lines crossed at a location Martin's team had recently used for a donor afterparty, and the employee badge that opened the service elevator for the man in the blurred profile belonged not to Carlton but to a temporary staffer whose contractor had previously printed signage for Martin's rebranding tour. Whether Carlton had been in the room later, earlier, or at all became less important than the recognition that the narrative had been engineered to make Carlton the obvious peril. A story that cleanly fabricates a forbidden affair tends to be the story someone wants the city to serialize. None of this absolved Ted of the ways he had broken his home. The confession deferred around the child with Leslie was a fracture no forensic audit could heal. Even if the bed rumor proved manufactured or misdirected, the life he had compartmentalized had sharp edges that cut everyone who touched it, and the deepest cut was the trust Nicole had offered him as the fragile currency of their public work. What changed for Nicole was not the fact of her divorce but the geometry of her response. Public outrage was an easy path. So was the theater of confrontation. She chose instead a posture that looked like stillness but was in fact the slow choreography of control. She documented rather than denounced. She collected contracts, traced dummy entities, and aligned bank activity against the dates where emotion tried to distort memory. She protected the boundaries around the child who had not asked to be born to a controversy and refused to let the city weaponize that existence into clickbait. She told herself that love can die without requiring the execution of the beloved, and she acted accordingly. In private, she felt the humiliation of layered betrayals, the dizziness of seeing her marriage reframed every 2 days by a new leak, the ache of watching people who claimed to champion truth accelerate lies because they were more delicious. In public, she stabilized the Foundation's programming, rerouted partnerships that had quietly relied on Martin's access, and insulated the staff from the political blowback by decentralizing decision authority. She observed Carlton with the patience she reserved for people caught in the undertow of other people's storms. If he loved Ted, that love was now a complicated thing, equal parts aspiration, grievance, and the tender hope that shames itself for existing in the wrong season. If he had conspired with Leslie, the conspiracy had been less a plot against Nicole than a desperate attempt by two people to reclaim agency in a narrative that routinely treated them as props. The only person who appeared to benefit cleanly from every ripple was Martin, whose scandal lost oxygen each time cameras pivoted to Ted's bed rather than Martin's books. Every time a pundit speculated about Ted's sexuality with the schadenfreude of someone who confuses intimacy with spectacle, a lobbyist breathed easier and a contract survived another day that I in the space between what the city wanted from her and what she needed for herself. Nicole decided she would not participate in the polarization that turned complex human wreckage into two-dimensional villains and saints. If she discovered incontrovertible proof that the man in the photo was Carlton and that the encounter predated the separation, the law would inherit that fact, not the carnival. Her reaction would be governed by the principles she wanted to live with when the noise died: the refusal to cast shame as justice, the insistence that a person's private orientation not be conscripted into entertainment, and the acknowledgement that betrayal can coexist with compassion without collapsing into excusal. If she discovered that Carlton had been baited into the frame by the very machine that wanted Martin's name buried beneath the wreckage of her marriage, then she would treat him not as the architect but as a casualty, one more person rearranged by the same centrifugal force that had spun her life apart. She kept one eye on Leslie, not because Leslie was an enemy, but because Leslie had become the hinge on which multiple doors swung. The door to the child's future, the door to a reckoning about how the city treats women who refuse to remain ornamental in scandals they did not design, and the door to the quieter possibility that two women might define their dignity without requiring each other's defeat. As the hearing dates approached, Nicole prepared for discovery with the same obsessiveness she once reserved for gala seating charts, noting which emails would be subpoenaed, which contractors would fold under oath, which nonprofit partners would distance themselves at the first whiff of inconvenience, and which would surprise her with a loyalty that owed nothing to image and everything to shared work on the ground. She met privately with counsel to structure a settlement that secured the foundation from being used again as a wash for favors, one that provided for the child without tying that child's well-being to the volatility of Ted's reputation, and one that left Ted space to rebuild his life without requiring her to be his scaffolding. The city, unsatisfied with the quietness of her approach, tried to force a climax. Anonymous accounts promised a second video. A gossip feed teased an interview with a hotel staffer who would place Carlton in the room and describe clothing he could not have seen if the lighting were as dim as the photo suggested. A rival candidate to Martin railed about morality while courting the same donor class that had funded the Shell initiatives. Through it all, Nicole returned to the simple work of correcting the record in the places where correction mattered: the accounting ledger, the project brief, the board minutes, the policy for vendor selection, because that was where scandal starved to death when denied the diet of dramatics. She never denied her grief. Grief moved through her like weather, and some days the forecast was full of sudden, localized storms. But she refused to surrender authorship. If the bed photo was real and if Carlton was the man, then her pain did not metamorphose into permission for the city to humiliate a man for who he desired. If it was staged, then her restraint denied the orchestrators their harvest, because scandal marketers feed on extremes, and measured humanity is famine to them. Ted, for his part, oscillated between contrition and defensiveness in ways that made sense to anyone who has ever watched a person reckon with the self and fail and begin again. He sought to do right by Leslie and the child with a steadier hand than the one that wrote the first checks. He confronted the consequences of the Martin entanglement by cooperating with what inquiries would accept his testimony, and he learned the hard, late lesson that transparency cannot be retrofitted without cost. Carlton became quieter. If he had ever been a patient architect of injury, the blueprint had collapsed under the weight of real people bleeding at its corners. If he had only ever been a man who loved another man and misread the timing of courage, then he carried his own private inventory of shame and something like resolve. Leslie drew a perimeter around her child and tended to a future that did not depend on anyone else's guilt to remain upright. Martin, sensing the appetite for chaos had shifted, retreated to a safer distance and allowed surrogates to speak for him until the headlines softened, which they always do, because the city's attention span is both a curse and a mercy. And so the end of this chapter did not look like a public execution or a triumphant restoration. It looked like paperwork and the hum of a printer and a signature that closed one ledger and opened another. It looked like Nicole moving into a smaller place with better light and discovering that morning quiet could be a form of power. It looked like Ted carrying the weight of his choices into therapy rooms and budget meetings and supervised visits that restructured his days into honest scaffolds. It looked like Carlton rerouting his loyalty from the abstract ideal of love to the concrete practice of integrity, finding ways to be useful that did not require proximity to other people's marriages. It looked like Leslie refusing to become the city's favorite archetype, the other woman, and instead becoming a mother with a job and a boundary that hardened each time someone tried to monetize her pain. The question of who lay in that bed on that night became, over time, less the fulcrum of the narrative and more a cautionary footnote about how quickly a community will convert ambiguity into entertainment when presented with a tempting silhouette. The deeper question, who benefits when a scandal about a bed distracts from a scandal about power, remained, and Nicole did not let it drift into the forgetfulness the city awards to anything that doesn't sing. She filed her affidavits, delivered her evidence where it counted, and when the opportunity to expose the architecture behind Martin's shell work arrived, she was ready with a map and a steady voice and a refusal to confuse vengeance with justice. She did not need the city to choose a villain between Ted, Carlton, and Leslie because she had learned that the story was never about the neatness of blame. It was about the maturity of accountability, the discipline of truth, and the long, unspectacular labor of rebuilding a life without the safety net of illusion. If someday a private certainty reaches her that it was Carlton in that room and that love, not malice, placed him there, she will grieve that truth in the privacy it deserves and continue forward. If someday it is proved that the room was bait and the photo a composition arranged by the same hands that moved money through aliases and favors through clay conduits, she will stand in whatever courtroom or hearing room the moment requires and describe how easily a city can be made to stare at a bed while its institutions are looted in daylight. Until then, she will keep her promise to herself, to live without borrowing lies for warmth, and she will step into each day with the quiet, stubborn insistence that survival is not the absence of pain but the presence of meaning, chosen and chosen again, even when the world demands a spectacle and calls any refusal to provide one a weakness.